Our culture is immersed in relativism. What is relativism? And can you discern it? We'll explore this and more on this edition of Life Matters. Brian Johnston is the Western Director of the National Right to Life Committee. He has served in many capacities while advocating for innocent lives, as California Commissioner on Aging, as Chairman of the California ProLife Council, on the board of the National Legal Center for the Medically Dependent and Disabled. And now here's our host, Brian Johnston.
Welcome back to Life Matters. We're your program on the right to life, on the very real battle that's going on right now about that idea that there's such a thing as a right to life. What is it? It's a straightforward statement. It's a statement that appears in the founding documents of the United States of America, and it's the aspiration of mankind in Western civilization. And that's the statement that we, each of us, have been given our lives as a gift, an inalienable right to be alive by our Creator. We've been endowed by our Creator with this unalienable right to be alive. The government didn't give us the gift of life. The government, in fact, has a duty to ensure this right to be alive. As long as we are innocent, the job of the government is to protect innocent lives. This is a very important premise. It's been violated, as you know, in 1973. The Supreme Court pretended it didn't exist. And even though every state in the Union had laws protecting babies in the womb, those laws were struck down by the famous Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton decisions. And right now in the United States, the right to life is simply vacated. It's kind of arbitrary. That's terrible, because there's a battle for lives. And unless the right to life is asserted properly and effectively and legally, we will lose all our other rights, because all of our rights to be secure in our person, papers, and property, our right to keep and bear arms, all of that is to protect our lives. It's human life that has intrinsic value and worth. So we're going to talk about that now on Life Matters. We want to equip you for this battle because it's a real battle. It's raging. It is the battle of ideas. We said last time you need to understand what natural law is, and that famous phrase, the laws of nature and of nature's God, because that's what America's founders, that's what they appeal to, these laws that are written in nature, self-evident truths. And we talked about where it comes from. We also spent some time for our Christian audience, and we're glad to have you, to remind you that of all people, it's Christians who should understand natural law. It's Christians who actually concur with natural law, even though it was Aristotle and then Cicero, Thomas Aquinas, all the way through Western civilization, natural law was being asserted till finally our founders in 1776, they asserted natural law as the basis of just laws. So even though it was asserted before the existence of Christianity, remember it's the laws of nature and nature's God. God existed before the Christian era, and it says in Scripture that He's made known His invisible nature through His visible creation, so they're without excuse. Everyone can look at nature and can see that God has designed something here. They may not know further details about who God is, but He's demonstrated His existence. We spoke about that at length in our last episode. So if you want to go back, and if you listen to podcasts, go back, and we have all of the citation in the notes. And if you truly understand Scriptures, you understand the assertion that God exists. He is. Now, since laws are made on natural law, there's actually some folks who don't like that, and they would like to assert new ways of making laws. And we're going to talk about that now because that's part of this battle we're in, the battle of relativism, that you can't know truth, that it's arbitrary, that it's just a miasma of confusion. And so I want to explain to you a religion now that's actually being promulgated in our culture. It really is, and it's not Christianity. It's a religion of relativism, and it has a very definable basis. A lot of times, people who practice relativism do not understand its basis and why they think the way they do. We're going to spend time today talking about relativism, and in particular, progressivism, why it's a compelling religious theory that doesn't believe in God, but it's a religion, a belief system. And very often that's what you'll get what they believe. And when they seek to offer scientific or objective facts, they have to reach and make things up. And if you study the science, quote unquote, that they offer, it's not truly scientific. Very often what they do offer is conjecture about the future. And we'll talk about that at length and why the future and guesses about the future form so much of the Hegelian worldview. Again, most progressives don't know anything about Hegel. Anyone who has studied Hegel knows that the writing of Hegel is rather convoluted, but his essential premises on the advancement of civilization and the flow of history is written out pretty clearly in his book on history. And in his book on history, he explains what's known as a dialectic, and that is the competition of ideas and the resulting synthesis from this fight over ideas. And this is such a common foundation for most of academia. We're going to come back to that after our break. I want to remind our Catholic listeners, if you're familiar with the Second Vatican Council, please look into the First Vatican Council, which actually was convened in the 1860s to deal with this very issue, the problem of academic falsehoods that had swept through Western civilization in the 19th century. And in 1868, the First Vatican Council was called in order to assert what is true and why so much of the deceitful ideas that were infecting the church, too. They were leading the culture, but it was a battle of ideas. And so the Roman Catholic Church realized we've got to clarify these things. And I'm glad because they actually cited Scripture at length, and they cited natural law as being demonstrable. When we come back, we're going to talk about that, what the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church is on this, and how the Church itself had to admit it had been infected. And if you're not a Catholic, don't look down your nose at that, because I know a lot of Christians that have been infected with Hegelian progressive attitudes. And they don't realize how that worldview is at variance with essential Christian doctrines, with the idea that truth is demonstrable, that it can be known, that it's demonstrated in nature. Hegel and progressivism is actually at war with that. The idea that truth can be objectively known. We'll be right back.
Life Matters continues after this.
Do you hear that sound? That's the sound of a child's heart beating. It can be measured as early as 16 days after conception when mom, she may not even know she's pregnant yet. And yet that unique human life, that boy or girl, has his or her own blood supply and circulatory system dependent on mom. The facts are on our side, and facts are terrible things to waste.
California ProLife is dedicated to winning California back for life. For more information, go to californiaprolife.org.
California ProLife is looking for folks like you to help us bring common sense back to our state. Would you like to volunteer? For example, do you like social media? You could help. Or do you like to put on parties? You might have the skills to help us with one of our local events. Would you like to just encourage local pro-lifers with insights and information? Join one of our chapters. There's a lot to do in this state, and your help can make a difference right where you are. Go to California Pro-Life and sign up.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Well, welcome back. We're talking about progressivism. Where did it come from? What is its foundational premise? And to really get a hold of that, we have to recognize that you're in a battle of ideas, that there are ideas in conflict. And there is objective truth. That's one of the premises that America's founders put forward. And they, in fact, were fighting the battle of ideas as well. And at the time that they wrote, in 1776, you saw huge conflict in the academic and intellectual world, and particularly in the world of government. So they felt a responsibility to get it right. Subsequent to that, some of those wild ideas continued to grow. And in the 19th century, you might say they came to a head. We mentioned that the First Vatican Council was actually called to deal with these false versions of truth that had infected all of academia. the universities and all of the thinking system and all of the ruling classes were being infected with a new version of what is true, that truth could actually be created. And this was quite alarming because it had infected the whole world. So the church, in the Roman Catholic Church, had a responsibility to address these things. And in the First Vatican Council, 1868, they addressed these issues of relativism. And that council continued. If you'd like to read up on this, it's heavy reading. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to distill the real battle of ideas so it's much more manageable for you. But if you want to, you don't have to be a Roman Catholic if you want to read the encyclical on modernity, which was actually written later in 1907 by Pope Pius X. And he explains this battle of ideas and just how dangerous it was, that it would kill many. He was prophetic, and that it was destroying the souls of many, even those in the church. He was addressing himself to teachers within the church that had adopted these ideas. And so as we talk about Hegel right now, I'm going to explain Hegel in particular because he's come to represent and almost be the culmination of these ideas that inspire a humanistic view of truth, that you can create truth and you can be part of the process of creating truth. Yeah, it's really amazing. So I'm going to do this. Let's step back for a second and I will describe for you Hegel's thinking. And in particular, the easiest place to get a hold of Hegel is in his philosophy of history. Because before Hegel, history was seen as just a bunch of random events and not really put together in any specific way. But now, because of Hegel, we see history as a flow, as going in a direction, and that it actually has a purpose. And let's explain why he comes to that conclusion. According to Hegel, ideas are what move things along. And I would agree with him. Ideas are critically important. But he then created a formula that seems very scientific. And that formula is this, is that you go back in human history and certain ideas come into existence and people get excited about them. And so he goes back and he points out that at one time people got to do whatever they wanted to, but there was a lot of confusion. This unvarnished liberty created some confusion. And so the idea popped up that we need a leader, and therefore the time of kings came into existence, where kings would rule and make rules and organize society. And that was the animating idea for society. And so what happened from there is that sometimes kings became dictators and tyrants, and people didn't like that. There was a conflict. And in Hegel, conflict is an essential part of what he calls the dialectic. So I'm describing now the dialectic. So from absolute freedom to tyranny under a king sprung a new idea. A new idea was birthed in that conflict. And that was the idea of organized, yet still free decisions by individuals through pure democracy. And this was the age of the Greeks. And thanks to Plato, Socrates, etc., the Greeks started thinking for themselves, and therefore, in Hegel's view, this birthed democracy where people themselves could be making the laws. So this was at variance with the idea that the king should be in charge. So this conflict of ideas are the essential premise behind Hegelian view of history. Think of it as a ladder. He views history as going upwards, moving forward to a special place, an attainment of goals. And this conflict continues. And he explains that even democracy, and if you go back, he was right. He was looking at this in hindsight. But the Greeks had a hard time with pure democracy because there would be a lot of confusion. And this confusion of everybody getting what they want, and then if it was just the rule of the majority, very often it would be mob rule. And this was not a good idea. And so the conflict then of these two ideas, of having an ordered government and having the freedom of the individual, these came into conflict. The thesis of an ordered government, the antithesis of the individual, they created a synthesis through their conflict. This was synthesized into the idea of a republic. How about a republic where you could still have your voice as an individual, but there would be leaders elected, and they could determine the laws. And so a republic was this new idea that was born. It was the synthesis of those conflicting ideas. So that's the very heart, very simple overview, but that's the very heart of Hegel's view of history, that an idea, a thesis, then gets a reaction, an antithesis, the antithesis, and they go into conflict. And this conflict is propelling history forward. And those two battling ideas create a synthesis of the two ideas. And that synthesis creates a new thesis. And so it goes on. And think of it as a ladder, climbing upward, that there's a flow to history. And this is where Hegel has really influenced us. And as I describe Hegel and his influence, and you'll see it now because we're going to move to some of the other ideas in progressivism, that this has infected our whole society. So I'm going to describe to you some of the political ideas that have emanated from progressive Hegelianism, and you know that they're bad ideas, and that would be socialism. In fact, there's a direct relationship, and all the types of socialism. National socialism, and that was the conflict of ideas that took place in Germany, as you know, most clearly embodied in Germany, where the German people felt that the Aryan people had been oppressed after World War I. They were downtrodden. They were made to pay for all of what happened in World War I, and they felt oppressed unjustly. And they wanted a new justice. They had to strive and they had to create conflict to get there. So that was National Socialism. But also international socialism is based on the same idea that there's an injustice, that it must be reached for. And it's in the future, but you have to reach for it, and you can. Because Hegel tells us that history is reaching upward, that we're part of history. And that's an essential part of Hegel, that history has a flow of ideas, and it's going somewhere. And these ideas are spiritual. See, and that's where the real dynamic of Hegel comes in, because he's asserting a spiritual quality to history. The Geist, which is a German word for spirit or idea. And that's used quite commonly in German. Those of you who have ever been to Germany, the Holy Ghost is the Heilige Geist, that it's a spirit. And so this spirit of history, he says that mankind is interwoven. And the scary thing about Hegel is that he implies that your spirit is interwoven with your form of government. And that's where progressives, often they themselves don't realize. They want ultimate freedom, and they know there's been injustices, and so they will say, there have been injustices that we feel. So like Hitler, he felt an injustice was what happened to the German people, and that had to be made right. And Marx felt there was an injustice of property ownership, and that had to be made right. And so we would strive for that goal of making right history. And we would right those wrongs. We would make things right. And this was part of our destiny. And we needed to move in that direction. And so this gives an animating spirit to history itself and to the individuals. Now, human individuals who otherwise might see history as confusion and their own life as confusion and arbitrary events that happen to them. Hegel is giving a sense of purpose. And so when he taught this in Berlin initially, this was very exciting to young college kids. And not only to that, but it actually infected all of the academic world that came out of that time period. And it swept through the world. The Hegelian view of history became a foundational view of the world because it gave a purpose to history. And there's a lot of people who are looking for purpose. So Hegel is very much with us still. This ladder, this flow of ideas that we're going somewhere, that if we do the right thing, we're going to change history. And even though we're mere cogs in history, your life has a purpose as a cog of history. We're going to that great, big, beautiful tomorrow, shining at the end of every day. The hope is there, brother. You can engage in this conflict. The revolution is moving us forward to ultimate freedom. It's a very fetching idea, and we'll talk about it more in just a second.
Life Matters continues after this.
You know How about our car donation program at California Pro-Life? We use one of the most respected programs in the nation. Go to the California Pro-Life page, californiaprolife.org. Scroll to the bottom and click on Donate My Car. It's that easy. Did you know you can also donate any vehicle, boat, motorhome, or even personal property? If you are nearing retirement age, you can also get a tax deduction by earmarking a portion of your upcoming compulsory distributions from your 401k. Just email us for information. California Pro-Life is fighting to equip California pro-lifers with understanding and the tools to again protect the unborn and other vulnerable innocents. Thank you for your help in this battle. Go to californiaprolife.org. That's californiaprolife.org for more information.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Okay, well, we've established that Hegel is an animating influence to much of contemporary thinking and to many of the ideologies that are swirling around us. So obviously to Marxism, as you have heard, but also to our whole culture. Many of us, and I'll have to admit, I grew up in the American culture. And even though my folks came here from Europe, but the American westernized culture really now is everywhere in the world. And it has embraced many aspects of Hegel. Again, we're talking about Hegel viewing history as a flow, as an ongoing ladder that moves forward. But the way the rungs of that ladder develop is through conflict, through the conflict of ideas. And so Hegel views conflict as necessary, that this alienation that people feel when one idea is ruling, that's okay because they'll form a new idea in order to create conflict. And the conflict of those two ideas creates a synthesis. The problem with that is that the idea of truth is lost. And what's asserted is that truth and justice, they're off there in the future. It's where we're going. But truth and justice also can be applied any way you'd like to. And that's the huge danger of Hegel, is that it's very inspecific. It gives inspiration and spiritual purpose to lost people who feel like they don't understand what life's all about. And very often in the academic world, as I said, this really is a dominant worldview in academia, in the university system. But I should remind you that even when you go off to college, I happen to go to what used to be called a state college. They're now called state universities. But they, even before that, before there were state colleges in our academic system, they were called teachers' colleges. And so even at teachers' colleges, this view of history and the flow of conflict and righting wrongs through social change. And again, it's social change and the form of government. And that's what is implicit with Hegel, is that your spiritual identity is wrapped up in the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, and the government under which you live. The form of government controls your spirit, is at the heart of Hegel. And so many progressives think that, well, we're going forward to freedom and we're going to fix what's right. We're going to make it right. We can bring about a future if we just move forward. But they forget they're saying it's the government that does this. And the same progressives who hate faceless corporations somehow embrace a faceless government, the largest possible corporation you could have. And that government is the answer. Government will empower with spiritual reality and bring spiritual reality to pass. And so they vest themselves in changing government. They vest themselves in statism. So the state is what dictates what's true, and the state will make that possible. And they're committed in a spiritual way. They're spiritually committed. It's a faith in the future that comes about through following progressive ideas. And if you just get on board, you'll understand. You have to be part of it to really get it. And that's the real attraction of progressivism, rooted in Hegel and then executed through particular ideological actions. These things are dedicated to bring about new truths. Whereas if you believe in the right to life and you believe in common sense and self-evident truth, if you believe that there is a creator, what the creator has done is made known truth already. That truth is self-evident. It doesn't mean you don't look for it, but you have to look for it and consider what is demonstrated in nature. You know, science at its very heart is an admission that natural law, self-evident truth, is what runs the world, really. Because without natural law, without a God of nature, science wouldn't work. So science is an attempt to understand what is actually true by looking at nature. It is true in the present tense. What Hegel does, it sounds scientific, his version of history, but it's conjecture. It's not based on what is provable and observable. It's based on what you want the future to hold. It's based on your emotional desires and perhaps spiritual desires, your ideas of what you think the future should hold. And therefore, anything can be true if you assert it. And that's why you hear people saying things that really, on their surface, is rather absurd. The idea that, well, how many genders are there? We're being told there's 40 genders because if someone feels they're a particular gender, and apparently they've given them names. If they feel that's what they are and think that's what they are, well, then that's their truth because truth is relative. And that's the world they're going towards. And truth becomes relative. Truth has no foundation in the present. It's all about the future. This desire, this passion, this religious appeal of forming the future and giving the future a purpose that conforms with your ideas, that's extremely attractive, and it has infected our culture. So you have to watch for Hegel's influence on your own thoughts, on your own way of seeing things, because truth, according to Scripture, if you are a Christian, truth already is made known. Truth is demonstrable now. And if you go back, I mentioned Pius X earlier when he was condemning modernity. Again, it's called modernity because it's a view of the future. And this view of futurism, that we're going into the future, was particularly carcinogenic to Christians. And that's why Pius X wrote his encyclical on modernity, that you have to watch out what you're thinking. And it's very important that you understand the right to life is based in self-evident truth. It's a truth that exists right now. It is what's right. It isn't what maybe will be right in the future. It is demonstrably true. And that's what America's founders built our freedoms on. So unless you see this battle going on and understand why your opponents are making up new truths and really believe it, you're going to lose in this battle. So carry on. Lives are at stake, and make sure that you speak up for what is true and right and just and demonstrable. The facts are on our side, and facts are terrible things to waste.
Learn more about everything in today's show online at lifematters.life, where you'll find all the resources you need to protect life. Life Matters is a production of the California Pro-Life Council, the state affiliate of National Right to Life. Wherever you are in the nation, you can find out more at National Right to Life. You can find vital pro-life information and also find the access to your state and local Right to Life affiliate. Get informed and get involved.